Nobody in Millbrook Hollow could explain why 17-year-old Dara Whitfield kept walking the county roads with a rusted wheelbarrow, stopping at every farm with a collapsed fence line to ask the same strange question. "Can I have your broken posts?" Not the good wood. Not the lumber anyone wanted. The gray, splintered, half-rotted stubs that farmers usually burned in a pile every autumn because they were worthless to everyone but her. She never explained why she wanted them, and for 2 years, nobody bothered to ask twice because the answer seemed obvious. She was just a strange girl with an empty barn and too much time on her hands. What none of them knew was that Dara had already done the math on something none of them had thought to calculate, and by the time they figured out what she was building, it was too late to laugh at her again. If you have ever watched someone get underestimated by an entire town and then quietly prove every one of them wrong, stay with this story, because the ending is the kind you will want to talk about. Drop a comment below telling us where you are watching from tonight, and subscribe if stories about grit and small towns are your thing, because this channel has more of them. Millbrook Hollow was the kind of place where everyone's business belonged to everyone else. It sat in a shallow valley where 3 creeks met, surrounded by cattle pasture and soybean fields that had been worked by the same handful of families for 4 generations. The town had 1 diner, 1 feed store, and a population that had been slowly shrinking since the regional slaughterhouse closed a decade earlier, and half the young people moved to the city for work. What was left was mostly older farmers holding on to land that cost more to maintain than it earned, patching fences with baling wire, and hoping the next winter wasn't as hard as the last. Fencing was the one expense nobody could avoid, and nobody wanted to pay for, since a single new pressure-treated post from the farm store could run several dollars each, and a quarter-mile pasture line needed hundreds of them. Every fall, farmers pulled the rotted stubs, tossed them in a burn pile, and grumbled about the bill for replacements. Dara had grown up watching those burn piles from her family's porch, and something about the waste of it had always bothered her more than she let on. She was not the kind of teenager anyone expected big things from. She kept to herself at school, spoke only when spoken to, and spent more time in the barn behind her family's small hobby farm than she did anywhere else. Her parents ran 11 acres with a few goats and a struggling vegetable stand, barely breaking even most seasons. Dara was not athletic, not particularly social, and not the type anyone pointed to as a future success story, but she noticed things other people walked past. She noticed that a fence post rotted at the base could still have 5 or 6 solid feet above the rot line. She noticed that farmers were throwing away wood that, with a little work, still had years of life left in it. And she noticed that nobody in town was doing anything about it. The idea did not arrive all at once. It started the winter she turned 15, when her family could not afford new posts to repair the goat pasture, and her father, frustrated, told her to just use whatever was lying around the property. She spent an afternoon sorting through a pile of old cedar and locust posts that had been pulled from a fence line years earlier, and to her surprise, more than half of them were still solid where the rot had not reached. She cut them down, sank them a little deeper to bury the sound wood, and built a working fence section for almost nothing. It held. That single afternoon planted something in her that would not let go. By the following spring, Dara started asking neighboring farms if she could take their discarded posts instead of letting them burn. Most said yes without thinking twice, since it saved them a trip to the burn pile and cost them nothing. She began hauling them back to her family's barn in a wheelbarrow, sorting them by wood type and condition, cedar and locust in one pile, everything else in another, because she had read that certain woods resist rot far longer than others and hold up better when reused. She had no formal training, no shop class background, just a stubborn habit of reading everything she could find at the library about wood preservation and fence construction, and a habit of testing what she read against what actually worked. The person who noticed her seriousness before anyone else did was Earl Kessler, a retired fence contractor in his 70s, who had built or repaired half the pasture lines in the county over 5 decades of work. Earl caught her sawing posts behind her family's barn one afternoon and stood watching for a long while before he said anything. Most folks let good wood rot in a pile because they don't know how to look at it right, he told her, and then walked over and started showing her things nobody had bothered to teach her. He showed her how to identify which posts had rot only at the soil line and which were compromised all the way through. He showed her how to treat the cut ends with a simple oil mixture to slow decay from starting again. He taught her that a post buried 2 feet with the right soil drainage could outlast one buried carelessly by nearly double. Earl became, without either of them calling it anything formal, her teacher. Over the following year, Dara turned her scrap collecting into something closer to a small operation. She kept a notebook, tracking every farm she visited, how many posts she collected, and how many were usable after trimming. By the end of that first full year, she had reclaimed just over 400 posts and successfully repurposed close to 260 of them into finished fence sections, either for her own family's property or sold cheaply to neighbors who could not afford new material. She priced her repurposed posts at a fraction of retail, still turning a small profit because her only real costs were her own labor and a bit of oil treatment. Word moved slowly at first, the way it does in small towns, mostly through farmers mentioning to each other that the Whitfield girl fixed their line for next to nothing, and it held through a hard winter. Not everyone was kind about it. At the feed store, a few of the older men made a running joke out of her wheelbarrow trips, calling her the scrap girl within earshot more than once, laughing about a teenager building a business out of what everyone else considered garbage. Her own uncle told her at a family dinner that she was wasting her time on something that would never amount to more than a hobby, and that she should be thinking about a real job instead. Dara did not argue with any of it. She kept working, kept her notebook updated, and kept showing up at farms with her wheelbarrow whether anyone believed in what she was doing or not. The real test came the summer she turned 16, when a stretch of unusually wet weather caused a section of fence she had repaired for a neighboring cattle farmer to give way after the ground softened around several posts that had not been set deep enough. Roughly a dozen cattle got loose onto the county road before they were rounded up, and the farmer was furious, telling anyone who would listen that he never should have trusted a teenager with his fence line. It was Earl who sat her down afterward, not to comfort her, but to walk through exactly what had gone wrong. The posts had been set correctly, he told her, but she had not accounted for how the specific clay-heavy soil on that farm held water differently than her own property. It was not laziness, he said. It was a gap in what she still needed to learn. And that gap was exactly what separated someone who quits from someone who gets better. She spent the next several weeks studying soil drainage, reset every post on that fence line herself at no charge, and this time buried them deeper with gravel at the base for drainage, a method Earl had used for decades but had never needed to teach her before, because she had never faced that particular soil type. The repaired fence held through the following 2 winters without a single failure, including one storm that toppled several brand-new store-bought fence sections on a neighboring property. The same farmer who had been furious with her became one of her most consistent customers, and it was Earl who later told her, in his usual understated way, that she had earned more trust that summer by fixing her own mistake than she ever would have by never making one. By the time Dara turned 17, her small operation had reclaimed and repurposed over 1,100 posts across nearly 40 farms in the county, and she had begun training a younger cousin to help her keep up with demand. She had saved enough from the business to cover most of her own farm's operating costs for the year, something her parents' vegetable stand had never managed to do on its own. The scrap girl comments at the feed store quietly stopped. What replaced them, eventually, was farmers stopping by just to ask her opinion on a fence line before they touched it themselves. The town never threw her a parade, and nothing about her story involved overnight fame. What changed was smaller and, in its own way, more permanent. People in Millbrook Hollow started looking at their burn piles differently. A few other families began sorting their own scrap wood instead of torching it out of habit. The girl everyone had quietly written off had not just built a small business out of what the town threw away, she had changed how an entire community thought about waste, patience, and what counts as valuable in the first place. If this story meant something to you, tell us in the comments what you would have done in Dara's position. and whether you have ever seen someone prove a whole town wrong. Subscribe for more real stories of people who built something out of nothing, because there are plenty more waiting to be told.